Hey guys, thanks for stopping by and checking out another What's Spinning single edition. As I mentioned in our episode earlier this week, I was going to be putting out this quick recap of soundtracks. And I compiled a bunch of information from lists all over the internet and from people who submitted comments on Reddit, a whole list of soundtracks, and came up with my own top 10 list. So let's dive right in. Before we get to the actual top 10, let's start off with a few honorable mentions. These are soundtracks that were really good but didn't quite make the list of top 10. So the first honorable mention I have, and these are in no particular order, but the first one is the soundtrack to Footloose. This one holds a special place in my heart because I've always loved the movie Footloose. I know it's an 80s movie and it's a teen drama film, but definitely the title track Footloose, everyone knows that once it starts and it kind of gets people moving. There's other big songs on here like Let's Hear It for the Boy, Almost Paradise, Holding Out for a Hero, songs that really capture the moment of that film. In addition to that, I've got the soundtrack to The Graduate. This one definitely, it probably should have been in my top 10, but some other ones kind of edged it out. The Graduate is a collection of Simon and Garfunkel songs, which I grew up listening to Simon and Garfunkel. My dad was a huge fan of theirs and was always playing Simon and Garfunkel records in the house. Most notably from this film is Mrs. Robinson. And then there's a bunch of other good, just kind of Simon and Garfunkel classics mixed in there. Sound of Silence is on here. Scarborough Fair. But definitely Mrs. Robinson. That's one that is most memorable from this film. So another one that my dad used to play a lot, he had this on vinyl, was The Blues Brothers. The Blues Brothers, of course, was a classic musical comedy film by John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd, where they played two brothers that were trying to save an orphanage by putting on a big concert to raise money. So the album itself is a great collection of blues tracks, plus there's a few funny songs on here, or fun songs like the Peter Gunn theme and the theme from Rawhide. It's just a great collection of tracks, done pretty well. A lot of good musicians came together on this one, and Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi they're great together. All right, now that we've got honorable mentions out of the way, let's dive into this list officially. At number 10, I've got the soundtrack to the movie Kids. Now, this soundtrack was released in the 90s. It's kind of that 90s lo-fi feel. It's got Lou Barlow from Sebadoh and, some folk implosion tracks. The biggest song on this is Natural One by Folk Implosion, but it's a good collection of songs that are all kind of that genre and just a good sound of the 90s that also helps capture the emotion and energy of that film. At number 9, I've got the soundtrack to Dazed and Confused. Dazed and Confused, of course, is a movie following a group of kids on their last day of school, 1976. So this is a really good compilation of 70s rock tracks. Some of my favorites are on here, like Rock and Roll Hoochie Coo, Slow Ride by Foghat, School's Out by Alice Cooper, Tush by ZZ Top, Stranglehold even by Ted Nugent. You've got Cherry Bomb by the Runaways, which makes its appearance on another album later in the list. Fox on the Run also makes its appearance again. Lowrider by War, Tuesday's Gone by Lynyrd Skynyrd, and, of course, Rock and Roll All Night by Kiss. You really can't go wrong with this one if you like 70s rock. It has a little bit of everything, and it's just a great collection. At number 8 on my list, I have soundtrack from the movie 500 Days of Summer. This was a movie with Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Zooey Deschanel, but the soundtrack to it is awesome. There's a couple of Regina Spektor tracks on here. One of them happens to be my most favorite Regina Spektor song, and that's the song Us. There's a couple of tracks from the Smiths, and then even a cover of the Smiths song Please, Please, Please Let Me Get What I Want by the group She and Him, which is the group that Zooey Deschanel is in. Really good Wolfmother track on here called Vagabond. There's also a Feist song and of course, You Make My Dreams by Hall & Oates. I don't know if you've seen the movie 500 Days of Summer, but there's a random kind of dance scene to You Make My Dreams. It's worth checking out. Next up at number 7 is the soundtrack to the movie Singles. Now, I probably should have rated this one higher, but there were some good ones at the top of the list that kind of pushed it down a bit. But in looking over the track list for this album, it has a lot of my favorite songs by particular bands. For instance, it has my favorite Alice in Chains song, Wood. It has my favorite Chris Cornell individual performance, the song Seasons. It has my favorite Pearl Jam song, State of Love and Trust. It also has my favorite Screaming Trees song, Nearly Lost You. In addition to those songs, there's a couple of tracks by Paul Westerberg. Dyslexic Heart's kind of a fun one that kind of gets you bopping around. Mother Love Bone's got tracks on here, so, additional combinations there of Pearl Jam, Soundgarden. Great recording of Battle of Evermore by the Lovemongers, which Battle of Evermore is, of course, originally a Led Zeppelin tune. This one sounds pretty close to the original. Good job on that one. There's a Jimi Hendrix song and then even a Smashing Pumpkins song. So really a good 90s collection of the Seattle scene right here. And like I mentioned, Alice in Chains' favorite song, Pearl Jam, my favorite song, Screaming Trees, my favorite song. So this one, I listened to it a ton in the 90s, and I was glad when they released it a couple of years back on vinyl, because it's one that I listen to a lot now as well. So that takes us up to number 6. And at number 6, I have a more recent release, and that is Guardians of the Galaxy Awesome Mix 1. Everyone's familiar with the Guardians of the Galaxy movies by now because the Marvel franchise is huge. The soundtrack to Guardians of the Galaxy, the first one, has a lot of great tracks. Hooked on a Feeling, Spirit in the Sky, Fooled Around and Fell in Love, I Want You Back by the Jackson 5, Cherry Bomb Again by the Runaways, Ooh Child by the Five Stair Steps, and Ain't No Mountain High Enough by Marvin Gaye. There's a couple of others mixed in there as well, but those to me are the highlights of this soundtrack. They did a good job here of pulling together some classics. That takes us up to number 5. And at number 5, I have another one that's close to my heart. Of course, it's another 80s movie because I'm a sucker for a good 80s movie. This is the soundtrack to Pretty in Pink. Now, Pretty in Pink, of course, has the title track by the Psychedelic Furs. There's also If You Leave by Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark. Really awesome 80s song. There's an NXS track on here. It's not one of their bigger known songs, but it does have that good NXS sound. And then, of course, another soundtrack with the Smiths, Please, Please, Please Let Me Get What I Want on it. Great sound of the 80s here. It's a John Hughes assembled soundtrack, so it really kind of built off of The Breakfast Club and the soundtrack success that happened there. All right, time for number 4. This one comes from the 90s, but not any 90s tracks on the soundtrack. This is from the movie Pulp Fiction, and Quentin Tarantino did a great job of just pulling together a bunch of classic tracks for this and introducing an audience that was listening to other music at the time to some older songs and expanding their musical horizons. Some of the things on here that really stand out, Son of a Preacher Man by Dusty Springfield, Urge Overkill, who was a 90s band, doing a remake of Neil Diamond's Girl, You'll Be a Woman Soon. I love that song. I love the part that it plays in the movie, and I love the sound of it on this soundtrack. A couple other good things on here, Jungle Boogie by Kool and the Gang, Let's Stay Together by Al Green. And then, of course, this soundtrack also has bits of dialogue from the movie, a lot of quotable lines. I myself saw this movie multiple times in the theater, which is not something I had done before. I just couldn't get enough of it. So I would always go back and watch it more and more, and my friends and I like to quote the movie, so it was great that the soundtrack kind of had that feel to it as well, with dialogue from the movie mixed in with the songs. All right, you've hung in there this long, so stick with me for the top three. Number three, I've got a movie that kind of doesn't fit with the rest of my list, but it's still a great soundtrack, and that is Saturday Night Fever. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I am not typically a disco fan. In fact, I couldn't name a lot of big disco songs if you pressed me on it. But this is a great collection. The Bee Gees mainly assembled and composed and performed a lot of these tracks, but they brought in a few other people to help round it out. Of course, there's Stayin' Alive, which is the most popular song from this album. Everybody knows the famous dance move John Travolta doing to Stayin' Alive. But there's also tracks like How Deep Is Your Love, Night Fever, More Than a Woman. There's Casey and the Sunshine Band doing Boogie Shoes, Disco Inferno. So really anything disco you can think of, it's on this album. So if you want to have some disco, but you're not a big disco fan like myself, this soundtrack's a great way to do it. And these songs they're just classic. Everybody knows them, so you can't go wrong. I should also add that, I mentioned that I looked at a bunch of lists across the internet when coming up with my top 10 list of soundtracks. And the thing that these top three had in common is that they were recurring entries on a lot of these lists. Not to say they were on every list, but they kept showing up. The more lists I looked at, these top three they were on a lot of them. And so that's kind of what pushed them to the top of my list too, is how universally accepted they are as great soundtracks and that they speak to a wide range of audiences. So with that being said, let's move to number two, which is Forrest Gump. So Forrest Gump, great movie with Tom Hanks, and you follow kind of his character's life through multiple decades. The music does that as well. It collects hits from multiple decades that really fit the storyline and also kind of tell that American story through the decades. Great collection of songs. It's a 2 LP set. It was even a 2 CD set, I think, when it came out. So some of the more memorable tracks off of that soundtrack for me have to be Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival, Rainy Day Women, number 12 and 35 by Bob Dylan, California Dreamin' by the Mamas and Papas, For What It's Worth, Buffalo Springfield, and that's just the 60s decade part of the soundtrack. Let's see what else is notable on here. Break On Through to the Other Side by The Doors, Turn, Turn, Turn by The Byrds, Joy to the World by Three Dog Night, Sweet Home Alabama by Lynyrd Skynyrd, and Runnin' on Empty by Jackson Browne. I remember that one being in the movie where he's going on that long cross-country run and all these people are joining him. I've always liked that song, but I really liked its use in that movie. They've also got Go Your Own Way by Fleetwood Mac and On the Road Again by Willie Nelson. Okay, we've done it. We've made it up to number one. And I think I mentioned just a little bit ago that these top three albums kept showing up on different lists. This number one album showed up on every list, and usually towards the top. It's my number one. It was my number one before I even started looking at other lists, but after seeing it on every list that I looked at, it confirmed my choice. So at number one, I've got Purple Rain by Prince and the Revolution. The interesting thing about Purple Rain is it's all original material, so it wasn't a collection of songs that already existed brought together to form the soundtrack to this movie. It was all Prince tracks that they had to choose from a vault of tracks to make the movie from. I think I heard that the director had his choice of 125 tracks to piece together and build this soundtrack from. This soundtrack was so big that even though it was the sixth studio album for Prince, it was the first to feature his band The Revolution and really the tipping point of what made him a superstar. It was released in 1984, debuted at number 11 on the Billboard Top 200, and within 4 weeks had made its way to number one. The first two singles from the album were When Doves Cry and Let's Go Crazy. And then those were followed by the single for the title track, Purple Rain, Then I Would Die for You, and Take Me With You. Prince and the Revolution won a 1984 Grammy Award for Purple Rain for Best Rock Vocal Performance by a Duo or Group with Vocal. It also won Best Score Soundtrack for Visual Media and was nominated for Album of the Year. Prince also won an Oscar for Best Original Song Score in 1985. I don't have current stats on this, but as of 2008, it had sold over 25 million copies worldwide, making it the third best-selling soundtrack of all time. Whenever I listen to this album, whether it be on vinyl or on CD or MP3, or even when I had the cassette, there's not a song that I want to skip. I love every track on here. It starts strong with Let's Go Crazy. It ends superbly with the 8-minute, 41-second Purple Rain. But in between, there's just a bunch of awesome tracks. Take Me With You, number 2. The beautiful ones after that, Computer Blue, Darling Nikki, When Doves Cry, I Would Die For You, Baby I'm a Star. All of them are hits to me. And you know, I'm remembering now, I mentioned when I had it on cassette. So I received this cassette from my parents as a Valentine's Day gift, which I guess would have been Valentine's Day 1985, since this was released in June of 84. So Valentine's Day 1985, I would have been 8 years old. So 8-year-old me given this cassette as a Valentine's Day gift, probably the best thing I could have ever gotten. A little bit more adult material than I would give an 8-year-old today, but my parents knew me. They knew that I loved music, and it didn't really matter the material. They knew it would be safe in my hands. So, been a fan of this one since I was 8 years old. Still a fan of it today. Number 1 on my soundtrack list. If you don't have it or haven't listened to it or aren't familiar with it, well, if you're not familiar with it, you have to be living under a rock. But I recommend adding it to your collection today. If you don't already have it, go out and get it. All right, so let's do a quick recap of that top 10 list. At number 10, I had Kids. Number 9, Dazed and Confused. Number 8, 500 Days of Summer. Number 7, Singles. Number 6, Guardians of the Galaxy Awesome Mix 1. Number 5, Pretty in Pink. 4, Pulp Fiction. 3, Saturday Night Fever. 2, Forrest Gump. And 1, Purple Rain. I hope you enjoyed that top 10 list. If you have any disagreements or some additions, maybe things I didn't mention, send them in to me. Email is podcast@wildhogrecords.com. And as always, it's @SpinningPodcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I will be talking to you more middle of next week. Have a good one.